how parts of our communities are left behind. Now the dog works. On tonight's show, we have the privilege of speaking with Professor Robert Ashford, Professor of Law at
So yeah, in the meantime, so let's start with Professor Ralph. Maybe we could get started, just switch it around a bit, just due to the technical difficulties.
Robert, Professor Ashford comes back in, we'll bring him back into the conversation. So I'm going to begin by just showing this image, and this is one that Robert and I often show. When you look at this, I would imagine normally the first thing you see are faces, right? This is sort of the analogy here is, you know, we're tuned into seeing human sort of features just because we're humans. But what we will be talking about today is the vase. This is the white space in between the faces, and it actually takes concentration to see it and sort of lose track of the faces. And the analogy here is that we're talking about a different way of thinking about economics. Professor Ashford talks about it being a new paradigm. And the idea here is that to see the paradigm, you have to really focus on the vase. So we'll be getting into a bit of that later, and we'll come back to this diagram at the end, and hopefully the analogy will make sense. So here's a snapshot of wealth distribution back in 1989. This was around the time of the first sort of Rio conference, which was in 1992. And at this time, what the data showed is that the distribution of sort of wealth GDP was in the hands of about 83% of the wealth was in the hands of about 1/5 of the population. So 20% of the population had about 83% of the wealth. Now, when I'm teaching these topics, I usually ask students, you know, what is it like today? Do we have more distribution or is it more concentration? And if you look at the data, this orange here is population and blue is wealth. What it shows today, this is in 2023, is that 13%, remember it was 20% before, now it's 13%, has 85% of the world's wealth. So wealth is concentrating. And so this is a challenge, obviously, if you're thinking about inequality. Now, we've all gone through the global pandemic. And in the year 2020, when workers stopped working, they lost $3.7 trillion of employment income. But you may remember back in that year, at the same time, the economy and GDP kept going up. And what happened was billionaires, in this case, took home $3.9 trillion of wealth that was essentially from capital. So these are big numbers. And if you look at wealth in the US, I know more about this. Hopefully, we'll get into Belize and other countries in the future. But looking at the US, 10% of the population owns about 2/3 of the wealth. The next 40% basically owns the rest. So what this means is the bottom 50% of people in the US have barely any of the wealth here. And the top 1% has 1/3 of the wealth in the US. And if you look at this in terms of just numbers, absolute numbers, the top half of the population has the wealth. The green here is the top 1%. And then the bottom 50%, you can barely see them on the graph. It's in the sort of few percentage points. So we have inequality in the US, and it's similar in many other industrialized countries. We also have great concentration of ownership of the stock market. What this figure shows is from the year 2000 to the year 2022, the richest 1% saw their ownership of the public equity stock market go up from 40% in the year 2002 to 54%. So 1% owns 54% of the stock market. The next 9% in terms of wealth owns about 39% of the stock market. So this means that the top 10% owns about 93% of the stock market, right? Bottom 50% of households in America own about 1% of the stock market. So, when you think about what are the major sort of factors here in terms of where is wealth, how are people generating wealth, you can think here the ownership of capital is one key element in what's driving wealth. Now, this graph I find very useful. It looks at time from the 1950s until about 2015 in this case. And what it shows is this great decoupling. You see GDP, labor productivity going up, and you see private employment and median family income in blue leveling out. So the job prospects begin to level in about 1975, 1980. You can see this sort of decoupling that began to happen. And so, at the same time, this graph shows us, at the bottom one's quite interesting because it shows us wages as a percentage of GDP. Now, this is important when you think about how we distribute wealth, right? Right now, the primary mechanism for wealth distribution in countries is typically through work, right? So labor, if you look at the bottom graph in blue, wages as a percent of GDP is a really important metric you want to pay attention to. And you want that to be as high as possible if you're a worker. You want the greatest share of GDP going to labor. And what happened here is in about the year 2000, there's been a steady decline from the 1950s, but in the year 2000, happened in the US, this happened in about 42 of the 59 industrialized countries that was part of this study. And at the same time, that money goes somewhere. So if wealth is not going to people through wages, it goes to corporate profits in this case, or people who own capital. There are many factors here. So in the year 2001, I think China joined the World Trade Organization. I think there's a sort of trade opening up. There's also a financial openness that began to happen around that time. We've had continual sort of automation in the workforce. Now we have a new wave of that, potentially with generative AI, digital technologies. In the US, we've seen a sort of historic decline in labor unions, and that's now maybe changing a little bit recently. And there's been lots of interesting work that basically says, what we've seen over this time period in and Restrepo is due to rapid automation. Now, when you think about generative AI coming in, and you look at these kind of graphs in terms of wages as a percent of GDP, I'm concerned that we may have less GDP going to wages if more of the work is actually being done by capital technology. And that's where we're going with binary economics. If you look at this share of GDP in the US, in this graph, you can see it drops down to about the year 2015. And more recently, it's sort of leveled out. And you've got about a 5% decline from historic data, which was about 65%, in its heyday of GDP going to wages. Okay, so there's some interesting work. I was often wondering, if you look at this period of 1950 to 1970s and 80, what you've got here is the income that workers were earning was tracking with growth in GDP. And so, when you hear people in the US at least saying, make America great again, right? I think they're looking back to this time period where you essentially have GDP tracking with wages. Now, it wasn't a perfect time period because you had civil rights movement and other things happening. But one interesting question that some researchers asked is, well, what would have happened had the blue median family income sort of line here followed the trend of GDP? So how much income has been lost? And their study found some really interesting results. What this table means is in 1975, the sort of bottom 25th percentile were earning $28,000. In 2018, they were earning $33,000. Now, had their wages tracked with GDP, they'd have taken home $61,000. And if you look at black men, it's about the same number. They would have doubled their income had their wages tracked with GDP. So what they found is that the bottom 90% would have earned an additional $2.5 trillion in 2018 had their income growth tracked with GDP. And so what does that mean when you look at this whole triangle? It means $47 trillion didn't go to workers, right, just on this analysis. So this is sort of, where we're going with this is, well, what can we do about these challenges? So there's a whole range of new economic ideas emerging, and these ideas have different focuses on technological progress or dematerialization and energy efficiency. They speak in different ways about reducing consumption and focusing on less environmentally destructive goods and services. Some mention the reduction of the work week, going from 5 days to 4 days. And some talk about a redistribution of wealth or income, and also connect that maybe with a guaranteed income. And so my interest is to sort of look at all of these ideas and sort of think about, well, what could work? And I'm going to mention community wealth building briefly, but we're going to focus on binary economics. So community wealth building is an idea which actually is connected with binary economics. So essentially, it began, you can sort of track its roots all the way back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement with the Poor People's Campaign, looking at the need for more community-wide economic political institutions and opportunities. In the 70s, you had the Opportunity Development Corporations being created, and you also had employee stock ownership plans essentially be put in place. Now, I mention this because employee stock ownership plans are sort of created on the premise of binary economics. And what they do is they give workers an ownership stake in their company. And so if you ever heard of employee stock ownership and ESOPs, you've heard of binary economics, essentially, because it was the binary economists that put ESOPs into existence in the 70s. And it worked because if you think about what the dynamics are here, if workers have an ownership stake in their companies, they're likely to work harder, right? So you can see the logic that got this passed through Congress. And I think it was about 1974, the law was passed. Moving into the 80s, you had community land trusts, cooperative movements like Mondragon was 25 years old at that point in the 1980s. You then had financial institutions looking to develop communities and creating jobs. And overall, if you look at a whole range of ideas like these, you have position of where this idea fits in some of these new economic ideas. Now, Louis Kelso was one of the sort of primary thinkers about binary economics. And what he was arguing is that economic democracy lies in the elimination of differences of earning power resulting from a denial of equity of economic opportunity, particularly equal access to capital credit. And he also went on to say all citizens in a democracy. So binary economics at its core is trying to think about ways of giving everyone access to capital credit in a way that can give them ownership of capital looking forward. So I'm just going to pause a moment because Professor Rashford here has been phoning my cell phone. So I think he does have probably some connection problems. So I think
Robert,
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
yes.
yes, you're
Well, what a terrible situation. I got kicked out and couldn't get back in.
Well, welcome back. So
Thank you.
can you see the screen here? Can you see what we're sharing?
Not yet.
Okay, well, I have a picture of you and I and our universal basic income paper.
I see that.
So
You want me to start talking
yes,
by saying that there are three fundamental principles of inclusive capitalism, built on two original principles of Louis Kelso. Has great troubles with the idea that capital does work. Adam Smith's theory was that capital made labor more productive, but didn't do work of people. And that's called labor. I ask people, what's the word for the work of capital? There isn't any. There's no word in the English language for the work of capital. So that's one principle of the left. Labor more productive? Well, a lot of people would say yes. But the truth is, a more important truth is that technology makes capital much more productive than labor in task after task after task. So all the people who graduate from the universities around the world learn that capital makes labor more productive and technology makes labor more productive, but out of the inclusion. That's the second principle. Technology makes capital much more productive than labor. And the third principle, and I tell people to memorize this one, this comes from me. The more capital, more broadly, capital is acquired with the earnings of capital. The more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital to a broader group of people, the more profitable it will be. Broadly distributed capital income in future years, and therefore more incentive to invest in capital and labor in earlier years. So it's quite well known that that's the secret of inclusive capitalism. And although left-wing economics and right-wing economics, austerity and stimulus are ways to create fuller employment, the truth is that the real potent employment is the work of capital, which once it's paid for, remember, and then I say, you understand that 8 times 7 is 56, or did you memorize it first? A lot of understanding comes with memorization. And that expression, the more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, the greater the earning capacity of the earning capacity of the capital, the more broadly. First of all, they don't know that capital and labor both do work. They don't know that capital makes labor much more productive. And they don't know that a broader distribution of capital acquisition among the people, paid for with the earnings of capital, that's a credit transaction, will become more inviting to capital owners, the rich and the poor, because it will distribute more in 90% of the people to grow the Ford for the rest of us. enough jobs, but never creates jobs because labor's share of total production has to decrease. And these are things that are only taught in inclusive.
Yeah.
Employee
So,
purchasing stock as a form of ownership, and when I think it's stuck in the community land trust in there.
yeah.
Maybe later on you could come back to that. I'm not sure.
Yes, happy to. I mean, in principle, it's quite simple. Land trusts put the land in a trust. Essentially, you take the land that you would purchase as part of a house, a mechanism of buying only the house on the top. And typically, land trusts make housing affordable for lower income individuals. So it's a way to allow people to get ownership in a more affordable way of a property. Looking at these 5 general ways to increase income, you can target wages, you can try and push minimum wages up or just wages in general. You can look at capital ownership, you can get into debt, unsustainable. Private charities trying to address inequality is very systematically inadequate. Capital ownership based upon the current market principles that concentrate rather than distribute ownership of capital and then income. The current market approach is not what we're going to talk about. We're going to present the alternative to that. And most approaches, in the age of automation and now generative AI, as production becomes more capital intensive, as capital does more of the work, the value added work, the distribution of earnings will need to be connected with this capital intensity if families are to have a sufficient income to purchase essential goods and services. So what we're saying is as production becomes more capital intensive, if you don't have an ownership stake in that capital, you're likely to get left behind. And that's what all the data I was showing earlier is pointing towards. So here's, the data, the graph I showed about the proportion of wages, GDP going to wages was about sort of 65%. And the mainstream view is that the primary role of advancing technology is to increase productivity, particularly the productivity of labor. And this is what Robert was just talking about, the sort of classical view. And under this paradigm, this is the faces in the diagram we showed. The argument goes, capital makes labor more productive. Now, what binary economists view is the graph on the right. What they're saying is labor and capital both do work. They're incrementally fundamental, independent variables or binary factors of production, and technology makes capital more productive in task after task. And so under the binary economics view, it's capital productiveness that grows and contributes a growing percentage of total productiveness. And so down on the bottom of the graph, you've got labor productiveness. And this is you and I. Now, if you think about ourselves, we can get educated, we can develop our skills, but our productiveness will not be significantly greater. We will sort of tap out, whereas capital can get super efficient at a task. You think about robotics and you think about what AI can now do. What also is, go ahead, Robert, jump in. Yeah.
I'm going to, Lewis Kelser used to say, he's right, that without capital, wages would only earn subsistence. Every choice capital job, labor job we have is enhanced by doctors, by technology. The work of doctors, the work of crows have make tools, and so do monkeys, but they're not per capita more productive than the rest of us. We would be no more productive, very little more productive, if it weren't for capital. We camouflage the extent to which capital enhances our product, and we call it productiveness, not productivity. We can talk about that later. But I just want to say that there's a limit. No matter what kind of a genius you are, you may be able to invent something and get a patent, but the genius is captured in the patent which is a property right. Otherwise, if you learn something, it'll be copied by other people. You're not going to be able to earn a lot more in the long run. A few geniuses work. We can't have an economy that only works for geniuses. Okay, excuse me, Ralph.
No, it's fine. One thing we haven't talked about is the sort of the sustainability angle of this. And the one thing I find interesting about binary economics is it also sort of makes you think about non-human productiveness, which is the ecosystem services that the planet essentially provides us. And I put here, this dotted line is actually declining. The capacity of the planet to sustain us is declining. We're losing species. We have, climate change. We have, many toxic problems that we're trying to deal with now. So binary economics begins to put this all together, whereas the other system of thinking doesn't.
Absolutely. And the biggest worker on the earth is the sun.
Yep, there you go. And
so you can't own the sun, but you can own solar ships and windmills and so many things that tap on the work of the sun.
Right. And I'll come back to that at the end in terms of what might be options to think about. So just to be clear, when we're talking about capital, we're talking about real capital. This is the sort of machinery, structures, patents, trademarks, and the capital that makes the economy run, essentially. And so that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about financial capital. So that's just one thing we wanted to make clear.
And notice that the word capital is also used for money. And we're trying to help people understand their essential rights when three fundamentally different things: real capital that do work, that stocks and bonds, which get a portion of the work of real capital, and money, they're fundamentally different. How can you expect people to understand economics when they confuse those three terms?
Mm-hmm. So we wanted to just also put out labor productivity versus the current view versus how binary economists view it. So when you talk about labor productivity, it's typically work done by all factors of production divided by one factor, which is usually labor. And essentially increasing labor productivity allows firms to produce goods and services then at declining cost. You can become more efficient. This leads to cheaper goods. Cheaper goods can be accessed by more people in the market, so you get more demand for your goods and services, and that can lead to more production and productivity, and that's the sort of virtuous circle. Now, what binary economics does is focus on labor being productive and capital being productive, and points to this one fact that you really need to think about what is driving productivity. Is it labor and/or capital productiveness? And it matters as to what's driving it, right? And if you understand that, you begin to start thinking about if it's labor driving it, that gives you one scenario of how the economy is functioning. If it's capital that's driving the sort of productivity in the economy, then you need to start thinking about, well, who owns that? How are we going to distribute wealth? If the primary mechanism, as I mentioned before, is through wages, but capital is doing more of the work, you got to start thinking about what does that mean, right? And that's
Now,
where we're going.
Just to interrupt there for a minute, and we'll talk about that. No, productivity is key to growth. You'll hear economists pontificate. Unless you get increasing productivity, you're not going to get growth. Productivity is a ratio of all the factors of production divided by labor. Ratios do not do work. Labor does work, and you could divide growing GDP per button. That doesn't mean the buttons are doing the work. So you have to distinguish between productivity and productiveness. I'll let Russ take that over now.
Yeah, so this is an example that sort of builds on what we were just saying. So if I was carrying a sack, from point A to point B, I'm doing 100% of the work, 100% labor, that's me. But now, if a donkey is involved, in this case, we could carry 10 sacks from A to B. So now you can say that I, steering the donkey, are doing about 10% perhaps of the labor, and 90% is being carried by the donkey. The donkey is doing the work. So in this scenario, this is where we're saying it's important to think about who owns the capital. Do I own the donkey, or am I employed by somebody who owns a donkey to do the work? Now, when you take this to where we are in the modern economy, we have vehicles like this, which are going from A to B, carrying 10,000 sacks, potentially, and there's no driver. These are fully autonomous, automated vehicles. What happens is when they park, there's a driver that has a computer screen and goes between each vehicle and parks it in the dock and reverses it out, and then sends it on its way, carrying the goods and services. So this is an example of where capital is doing the vast majority of work. Right?
Let me interrupt again to say that at this point, many economists and non-economists will butt in and say, yeah, but it takes a person to, build the truck, and we concede that it takes people to think of, invent, build, design, install, operate, protect, guard, repair, capital. But that's not the work of the capital. And you wouldn't pay people to do that other work unless you were getting much more out of the work of capital than the work necessary to employ it. So we have to clear up our thinking, the cobwebs of our thinking from the very fundamentals. We've been hoodwinked from the beginning. It's not labor productivity. If it's labor productivity, we wouldn't be more productive than crows or monkeys. It's the capital instruments, including invisible instruments like patents that concentrate property rights in mechanisms that can be owned by many people, but there's a rent for them, there's a use for them. And that's the advantage of the share ownership approach. Excuse me, Ralph, go ahead.
No, it's useful to think about this as another way, is to think about tasks, what task is being done. And what's happening is if you divide your whole workday into all the tasks that you complete, I bet you can think of, if you go back a number of years or even recently, a number of tasks that are now done by capital that you used to do, or people in your company used to do that task. At Virginia Tech, we used to have paper forms, which required lots of people signing forms and managing all the paperwork. That's all gone, and so are the jobs related to that. I'm now doing those jobs myself, and the students are doing them. We've digitized those jobs, right? So when you think about work, as tasks become displaced by capital, at some point, the entity hiring you will look at your job and say, wait, your job is no longer containing the tasks that we hired you to do 10 years ago. So what do? Well, you create a new job. You create a new, you sort of, maybe you pay less money for a different set of tasks, which are less value added, right? Maybe you're paying more money for a different set of tasks, but think about the tasks and what is being displaced. That's kind of the way I approach this.
And at this point, the economists that are maybe unintentionally deceiving say, but technology creates more jobs than it destroys. That's not the issue. The point is that labor's contribution to total production increases as labor productiveness increases. That's what causes the concentration of economic power as a result of corporate activity that ignores this fundamental principle. It's not a matter of whether, yes, technology creates more jobs. You can prove it, but it doesn't create enough jobs to compensate for the capital, for the work that's now being done by capital.
And just on that point, this is a port, right? This is a port that's it's an example of what could happen. Fully automated ships coming in, vehicles picking them up, unloading the ships, putting them on skits or little skates here, and they drive off, go on into the town, into the city. It's all automated. Where's the workers? How are you going to distribute wealth or distribute GDP if there is no work?
And the 10%
this is the question that's fundamental.
Are going to earn that work.
Yeah.
Earn that capital.
So what we're
not the rest of us.
So I'm gonna speed up a little bit because I know we're already well into the time we have. But we've talked the first 4 points we have talked about quite a bit. What we're going to talk about is the fact that capital can pay for itself out of its future earnings, and it can distribute income to purchase production. So this is where we're going with this. Let me move on. So I've talked about this before. Binary economics or inclusive capitalism is an additional approach. It's not replacing necessarily. It's an additional idea that we think is worth considering. It's how you finance. I put in brackets here, sustainable. I think if we just finance growth, we could have unsustainable outcomes. So I think targeting this on sustainable economic development is a smart idea. And broadly distributing ownership of new real capital to citizens or people it's the principle of binary economic growth. And what I'm going to do, this was the one he said, memorize, memorize this statement. So I'm going to try and break it down into a diagram and help you just at least understand what are we saying when we say a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital creates a rational expectation of more broadly distributed capital income and consumer demand in future years, and therefore greater market incentives for the fuller employment of labor and capital and economic growth in earlier years.
Nobody said that before this century.
Yeah. So what does it mean, right? This is, one thing is memorizing it, the other thing is what does it mean? So here's what we're thinking about. This is what it means. So if you're an investor, you're looking ahead. You're always forward looking. What you will do is if you see an opportunity in the future, you will take your financial capital, you'll invest that in real capital and labor to create production, which then is sold to meet that increased effective demand in the future. And so what this phrase is saying is if you broadly distribute capital income in future years, you will have people with income from capital who can spend. That's what we're saying, this increased effective consumer demand in the future. If you perceive that's coming, in earlier years, you have now an incentive to deploy financial capital into real capital and labor to create production to meet that demand. So hopefully this diagram gives you a bit of a visual of what we're talking about. What we're going to move into now is, well, why with the earnings of capital? Just a quick summary. We've said labor and capital both do work. We said technology makes capital much more productive in task after task, and the broader acquisition of broader distribution of capital acquisition promises greater consumer demand in the future years, and therefore greater demand for employment earlier. That's the diagram we just showed. So why then with the earnings of capital? Why is the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital really important? And the simple answer is because labor rarely has enough to acquire capital. Labor income is just not sufficient to allow you to buy the capital.
And I would add the word alone, labor income alone.
Yeah, right. So we're going to do some quick examples to try and build up what we're talking about here. So if you buy a home, you typically go to a bank, you get the cash, and you promise to pay it back. You then take that cash and you buy the house you want. And then over time, you repay the loan. And once the loan has been paid off, you own the house. This is how, if you've bought a house, this is the mechanism typically you're using. Now,
And if you own no capital, you're doing that all with labor income.
Exactly. That's where we're going with this, right? So this is an example of capital paying for itself out of its future earnings, right? So now you're an entrepreneur, you go to a bank and you want to purchase an apartment. And what's happening here is the rent's coming in. This is your future income stream coming in. After you paid your operation and maintenance, you have profit coming back to you, which you then use to pay off your loan. Right, and once the loan has been paid, all future rent becomes an income stream from this capital. Now, if you put these side by side, you could say, well, what's the difference? And that's Robert was pointing to that. One, your labor income is doing the purchasing here. On the right-hand side, it's capital income that repays the loan. So when we say obtaining capital with the earnings of capital, It's the right-hand mechanism deployed in all shapes and forms of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital.
Now, a lot of people, go ahead. You want to finish?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
A lot of people who are poor and feel that there's been abuse of loans will say loans are bad, but it makes a difference whether it's consumer credit or capital credit. Consumer credit is dangerous because it enables you to buy what you cannot afford. But capital credit, future earnings of capital. And that's what's so critical. Depends upon what kind of debt it is. And
Right.
the advantage of a corporation is that it enables the shareholders to acquire capital before they're in the money to pay for it. When you ask a person without capital to compete with a person who owns capital for more capital acquisition, it's like asking a person to compete with a donkey for hauling. Can't be done. With labor alone, you can't compete with capital. And a few people can, you know, but even chess champions now are being defeated by the computers. I mean, you can a few, but it's statistically insignificant. It doesn't matter if there are a few geniuses who don't need capital. This doesn't matter to the most of the population. Half the people are below average, by definition. We need an economy that works for everybody. That's what's inclusive about it. Go ahead, Ralph.
So we're going to do a quick example here of exclusionary corporate finance to inclusionary corporate finance. So, and Robert, feel free to jump in as we go through this. So here's a corporation, one mechanism it can do that. So it goes to the bank, just like in this case, it's the corporation is the entrepreneur, you know, in the same as the rent example with the apartment complex. You go to a bank, you can get a cash loan. That cash is then invested in your planned growth. If the growth succeeds and goes well, you then repay the loan to the bank. And so this is one way that a corporation can grow. It can also use its retained earnings. So what are retained earnings? So if you look at a profit and loss statement, you've got your revenues minus your operating costs, minus your financial expenses, and that's your profits before taxes. And then profits before taxes minus taxes is what you have profits after taxes. And then if you subtract dividend payments from the profits after taxes, that's your retained earnings that can be reinvested in capital acquisition. So you have money as an organization, as a corporation, you can invest that money in growth. That's another way to grow and expand the corporation. Now, I put here Giovanni Ferrero. You might recognize the last name because it's the owner of Ferrero Rocher. And I was in Italy this summer, and he's I believe, the wealthiest person in Italy. So he was the person I used in the example. So if he owns this corporation, either borrowed money or retained earnings, what has he done? He's acquired capital through the corporation with borrowing money that was paid back with the future earnings of capital or by the retained earnings of capital mechanism. Now, he can also purchase shares using his own money. So about 5% of corporations sell, no, they sell stock, not 5% of corporations. But if you think of a corporation, about 5% they can sell stock to grow, essentially in the same mechanism. So Giovanni could purchase those stocks for full return common stock. That money going into the corporation goes to grow the corporation. The dividend payments come back then through the ownership of that full return common stock to Giovanni, and that mechanism continues forever as long as the corporation is functioning. Now, he can also acquire shares with borrowed money because he's a well-capitalized individual. He's got existing assets. So in this case, he can go to a bank and say, I'd like to buy stock in this corporation. Please give me a loan. They can, he can do, and then the same mechanism happens, right? The same planned growth happens, dividend payments going straight to his bank account, essentially. Now, he can also acquire shares with borrowed money that's secured by capital insurance rather than his own wealth, his own assets. So in this case, he would work with a trust, a fiduciary trust. That trust would go to the bank, and the bank would have to get capital credit insurance because there's no assets to secure the loan. And then the mechanism would play out with the trust, essentially investing in the corporation for full return common stock. They grow, the growth that they're planning to do. It could be an investment in solar energy or something else, a new product they're developing. If it goes well, the dividend payments come back, pay off the loan. After the loan is paid off, the question then is, where did the dividend payments go? Well, if Giovanni set up this mechanism and the trust is working for him, those dividend payments go directly to him. And so this is exclusionary corporate finance process, and it can concentrate earning capacity with the existing owners of wealth, and it fails to distribute this effective demand out in the future, that arc of the looking ahead. Who's going to buy the products if people? Binary economics is saying this is the mechanism, or these types of mechanisms are what is enabling this concentration of wealth. 51% of the population, 1% of the wealthiest individuals in America own 54% of the stock market. They can do it through mechanisms like this, right? And so one question that binary economics raises is, well, why does it have to go to one individual or to 1%? Why can't the same mechanism work, but for everybody? And this is where this dividend payment could essentially go to employees, customers, welfare recipients, citizens. That's to be decided by the community that's doing this. And so what the fiduciary trust is doing is it's extending to all people competitive access to the same non-recourse credit routinely available to individuals like Giovanni. And so now if you think about, well, you could begin to close the loop here. What happens if the income that's given to people by dividend payments is spent back in the goods and services, or on the goods and services provided by the corporations that, are connected with them in this dividend payment mechanism? So this is kind of the production, distribution, consumption loop, and it could be a mechanism for a new sort of type of economy that could begin to distribute wealth through capital ownership among a population. So we've sort of talked around this diagram in these slides, and we only have a few left. So hopefully when we say with the earnings of capital, it's clear what we're saying. It's these dividend payments that are going to pay off the loan. After the dividend payments have paid off the loan, where does that dividend go? It can either go to the 1% or it can go to the 99%, right? And what binary economics is saying is, if it goes to the 99%, you'll have increased effective demand in the future because they'll have more money in their pockets. And because of that, you'll have more deployment of financial capital earlier into real capital and labor and production to meet that demand.
And the real capital will have a higher earning capacity because it has, through broader ownership, created more demand.
Yeah.
So the real capital is actually more profitable if it's more broadly acquired.
So what I'm going to just put a little spin on this and saying maybe we should think hard about what we are spending money on, right? So this is the mechanism, and this is one way to address inequality by broadly distributing this payment of these dividends to people. But what we grow, what we invest in matters. And I just put this diagram here. This is a diagram of the 9 planetary boundaries. And in I think it was 2023, the scientists that created this estimated that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have now been exceeded. And so we absolutely have to start investing in goods and services that are as inherently sustainable and safe as possible. So inherently sustainable investments of goods and services. But how do you do that, right? And where do you begin? Well, we have plenty of certification systems around which we can look at to say, we can vet, is this investment, when you say, I've got an investment, do these go far enough? Probably not. but it's better than nothing to begin with. What kind of investments do we focus on? Well, this is data from participants that had a guaranteed income. And what it shows is, where did they spend that guaranteed income? People were spending on goods and services, groceries, transport, housing, utility costs. So this could be a space where you would target investment, because this is what people are basically spending money on, right? And so what we're really talking about here is this: you're financing inherently sustainable production in a way that provides residents ownership and future income stream via dividend payments from these investments. It's broadly distributed because you're really trying to reduce inequality and increase everyone's income, so they can purchase the sustainable goods and services that have been made available through this mechanism. So the idea is this sort of virtuous circle here. This is kind of with this system. So what I was thinking to end is, well, what can you do? So I was saying, well, what happens if we turn this trust into a Garifuna constituency trust, right? You could have the same mechanism here, where the trust doesn't have any assets, basically vetting all these investment opportunities on behalf of the trust. And it's doing that by looking at, you want to have a very sound, robust business plan, inherently sustainable ideas you're trying to advance. Essentially, you then make the loan, you make the argument saying, this is a really good investment, please give me the money. And now you could replace a commercial lender with a wealthy individual that wants to invest in the trust, right? There's many mechanisms this could look like. And so the same process happens. So you could have a renewable energy service that you're looking at. You'd be building solar systems, for example. You basically invest in that entity. You get a new full return common stock. You say, we guarantee we're going to take the dividend payments and pay off the loan until the loan's paid off. The same process happens. You can invest, in agrivoltaics, which is farming and solar, assuming there's plenty of sun, right? So you could do that. You then get your planned growth. If everything goes well, after you've paid for operation and maintenance, dividend payments go back to the trust, the loan is paid off. After the loan is paid off, the question is, where does that go? And so you could have a dividend to your people, your community. Could be targeting employees around it. You could target customers, you could target communities. That's to be decided. So here's just one example of how these mechanisms could really benefit communities. The idea that Robert has been talking about since I've known him is, once a general model, right, is understood, this trust could invest in any competitive and revenue generating opportunity. It's there, right? And they could then broaden the ownership of those economic activities through that. So, just in closing here, that there are potential barriers to how do you advance inclusive capitalism. They're not institutional, they're really political and power dynamic. All of the institutions to do this are largely in place, and they're benefiting those individuals who are wealthy right now. So these institutions could function potentially in an even more profitable way if we open up these mechanisms to citizens and community members. So often there's a first actor collective action problem, like, who's the first entity that's going to do this? Perhaps this is your community. You may be the first to do this. And this is where leadership comes in. We need leaders to think about, how do we do this well? How do we do this appropriately that makes sense for our people and can begin, you think about maybe 5, maybe 7, maybe 8 years. You got to think about that time frame, because that's what it might take for capital to pay for itself out of its future earnings. So these are longer term ideas, but they could be fundamentally transformative. So we've gone way past our time that we set, but we're back to the faces. Some people may say, I still see the faces. I don't see these ideas. It's not a problem. the approach to inclusive capitalism that we've outlined can be viewed really as a competitive and complementary approach to finance real capital investments. And if you see the V's, if you see really what we're talking about, that's fantastic. You now have an ability to understand the economy in a slightly different, possibly transformative way. And so I think that's all we have. We've gone past how long we thought we would, but as you can see, there's a lot here. And perhaps maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing the screen and then we can have a bit of time to have a discussion.
Sounds good.
Very good, very good. Yeah, Cyril, do you see any questions in the Facebook Messenger?
Maybe general questions, but I know once we start the FAQs, that's when people will start to, ask specific questions. I'll allow you to start.
Yeah, so I see it very relevant to our situation. Positioning myself from Dangriga, where I was born and grew up, raised and cultured. And we do see the need for a paradigm shift in how we generate wealth within the community. For example, I'm looking at these utilities, the Belize Electricity Board, all right? My question, and I don't have the answers right now, but my question is the Belize Electricity Board or corporation, whatever limit they call themselves, ensuring that members of the community can buy into the profits and as such regenerate those profits into, right? If there's a mechanism for us to buy shares or stocks from the Belize Electricity Board and that money goes back, I don't see it. I don't see that as we speak. There is the Water Authority Board that generates profits, but it's not transparent as to where those monies go. And I do see this this theory of economics as a meaningful way for a community to grow. For example, another example would be in the agricultural field. I know in the South, the citrus company owns the means of production, they own the factory, and they own huge tracts of land. And the small farmers cannot compete. So, and now the citrus industry is going, is becoming debacled. It's being debacled because perhaps they didn't have the foresight to invest in the community and have the community members reinvest in something that was bringing income to that community. Meanwhile, in the North, the British sugar industry owns the factory and they are limited only to the factory, but the farmers own the product. So there's a kind of symbiotic relationship going on there. So I think moving forward, it'd be good if we could look at what exists in Belize and what strategies we could come up to broaden the discussion so that we could have a better dynamic economic system.
Yeah, I think the key thing to really focus on is the capital paying for itself out of its future earnings idea, right? So whatever the investment, whatever the growth or the development opportunity is, the way you finance that is such that you're essentially having these dividend, think about it, the dividend payments are coming back to a trust, right? For example, that then pays off the loan. You're not buying anything with your labor income, right? Essentially, it's the loan that's coming into the trust that's investing in the growth or the development you're looking at. If that development is successful, if that business opportunity is successful, the profits are paid out through dividends, which pay off the loan. Now, once that loan is paid off, the bank steps aside, or the investing individual gets their return, they step aside, but that ownership the ownership of that entity, that enterprise, is the important thing. And if it's paid out, if you have an ownership stake by these the stock ownership, dividend payments go to the trust, and then the question is, where does it go? Does it go to the workers? Does it go to individuals in the community around that development? Does it go to all people in the community that you're supporting and enabling? So that's the key thing. It's capital paying for itself out of its future earnings. And that mechanism can be deployed to any revenue generating enterprise, right? So the key thing is to not sort of think about we're not purchasing stock using our wages. That's not the mechanism of binary economics. Robert, you want to add something?
Well, the things that we need to know before we figure out how this might be applied to your economy. Right now, you say that there are outside capitalists that own the land, that own a lot of the enterprise that are currently employing people. Is that right?
Correct.
And they're paying a certain wage.
Right.
Now, are those enterprises paying taxes?
Sometimes they're given tax breaks, but sometimes they do pay taxes.
Sometimes they're paying taxes. And they're given tax breaks for
10, 15, 20 years.
And what are they doing for that?
That's where we need transparency.
Pardon me?
That's where we need the transparency.
We're not sure what they're doing with that.
Yeah, we're not sure.
Well, it is a political decision to either impose the tax on people, or give them tax forgiveness. Now, right now, these negotiations have occurred because your people, my guess, or the countries that your people live in, have only been offered one alternative, and that is jobs and welfare, right?
Yeah. So let me give a typical example.
Cyril, before you go there, I think our people have labor and land. That's all. They don't have capital.
Well,
they don't have labor.
Land is capital, but it's not the only capital.
I wouldn't even to say that they have labor and land. Here's the thing: the ones that have land, they have sufficient land just for their to live, for their residents, right? Just to have their house. So they might not have extra, like maybe an acre to do extra farming, plant produce. So I'll give a typical example. There is this very this area in the south of Belize, where I actually live, in Dangriga. Belize has 6 districts. In the south, we have this deep water port, right? It is very, very valuable to the country on a whole. Now, this deep water port has been, let's say, abandoned for over 4-5 decades. Don't quote me on that. Let's go with 4 decades. For a reasonably long time. Now, based on the political party, they have individuals within who might have ministerial positions, and they will make a conscious decision not to open the sport or not to make the sport active, depending on how beneficial or not so beneficial it might be for them. Now, fast forward to 2024, after so many years, they now decided that they're going to open the sport because it's beneficial to few people. Now, mind you, the developer in charge of the port, owns resorts that the ships that will come and dock at this port. We are we have good reasons to speculate that when the ships come in, tourists come in, they will go to the developer's resort. Right now, I'm giving you guys all this detail because I want to give you somewhat of a bird's eye view as to how things operate here in Belize. So when it comes to the economy, when we as a people, we don't have land, or as mentioned, if we do have land, it's just a small square, just a place, just to live, right? We don't have capital, and the majority depend on the politicians. So my question to you, Professor Ralph and Professor Robert, take a bird's eye view of this situation. How do we get to a point where we could, as a people, or not only as individuals, but as a group, as the Garifuna indigenous people, how, in your wisdom, can we acquire capital to be self-sustained and not so dependent on the government or on politicians that come around every 5 years and give promises?
Well, I don't think we know enough about the situation yet, but I will say that these companies that are coming in have financial advisors that are advising those people who extend credit for their operations. These people have expertise. Those people, the expertise of those people can be bought by anybody.
Right.
There's no monopoly on the expertise. These companies have business plans, and they are expecting a profit. Now, one of the things you have to figure out in the profits is taxes. One of the things that Ralph didn't cover in this one is that as companies enable poor and middle class people who have no income of their own, or very little income, as they become capital loaders, we can spin them off the welfare, which reduces the tax burden. So by creating a financial incentive to eliminate welfare, you can create a much more favorable tax environment. Now, I can't decide how attractive that would be, but there are people who could learn about your economy. I suppose Ralph and I could too, but we're not. There's expertise here involved that's beyond understanding inclusive capitalism. So, but the outside financial capital people are going to be concerned about tax rates, and they're going to be concerned about welfare dependence. And we can both improve tax, and we can make it politically more attractive for people once they understand it is an alternative. Let me give you something else which may be far afield. I had a student who was a member of an Indian tribe, American Indian tribe. She wrote a very fine paper, not been published. But in America, I'm going to change gears for a minute. Imagine a tribe, a reservation near a place where there is no Walmart. There is no. I don't know whether your people have any interest in having the consumer income to buy products that Americans can routinely afford. But the shares that are issued to finance a Walmart plant in your, you may not want Walmart, but a plant in your area where the dividends, once the capital is paid for, can be used to enhance your product, the product. That becomes a win-win. A corporation can issue shares for debt, borrowed money, and the first. So let's say that. I'm just going to. I don't know if your country has any interest in Walmart. Let's suppose there's a manufacturer that makes money off food, clothing, shelter, communications, iPhones, you name it, whatever your people would like to buy if they simply had more income. Well, the first round of profits have to be repaid to the lender, but the second round of profits could be a Walmart owned by 50% by your indigenous people and 50%, let's say, by the sponsoring company. And the share, and once the shares have been paid for, they can use the dividends to purchase products that Walmart would like to sell them. And I don't know. You may be against Walmart. I don't know what the appetite of your people are. And if your people have only an appetite for goods that are, from the country, from your country, then that's another story. But it seems to me that I don't know your country very well, and your people very well. But it seems to me there are consumers there that would be happy to buy products that could be sold in Walmart stores, that could be sold by Apple computers. I don't know. You must be people. There must be spending money.
Yes.
On things.
Yeah,
well,
I see.
That money can be earned in dividends and used to buy company products.
Right. I see it in energy. I see it in energy. And the good example given was the solar, right?
Yeah.
The community go into solar, providing energy through solar panels. And as Professor Ralph had said, we create a trust where the dividends from supplying energy through solar can go back into the community either by expanding or providing other services connected with energy consumption, which that's a big one because it reduces poverty, right? The use of energy. Everybody uses energy at some point in time. So that's a big ticket item.
It's important. You're right. It's important to recognize that broadening ownership starts with a creditworthy investment, which can be made more profitably if it's more broadly owned.
Right.
That's the principle we're teaching.
Right.
It's looking for the that's what Robert was saying, is looking at the culture that you have and what are people buying, like what do they want, right? And that points you into the spaces where you may have these credit-worthy investments that could be financed in a way that broadly distributes the capital across a certain population. Maybe it could be geographically based or just people who are part of the Garifuna nation, right? So, I think there's, I was thinking, Cyril's question was a good one. It's like the bird's eye view. I'm kind of thinking the bird's eye view is, looking at specific opportunities that make sense. And then if you take your bird into space and look down, you see sort of nations, right? And so I really think that if there's a way of broadly thinking about how you could enable investments into a nation in a way that over time builds up the ownership of the economy writ large, I would predict that nation would become extremely an extremely interesting place within a couple of decades. I mean, I think it would be, people would be studying it, people would see the value, the people would be able to buy basic goods and services, maybe that are produced locally, local food supply systems, local energy systems that are owned by the people, right? Essentially. So that's kind of the mechanism. And I just put an example of solar in there because I'm assuming that there's plenty of sun, and there must be some land that's owned by individuals who would be interested in having a community scale system potentially.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned there's sort of state institutions of order and power. The challenge with existing systems is the interconnectivity. How do you connect these systems to the existing power grid? So it may be separate. It may be more of a community scale system, which is jointly owned, right? And now you have power sovereignty for that community. They own their own power supply.
The corporate structure will be more acceptable to the population and will be more wealth enhancing to the population if it broadens ownership than it would if the same structure were financed in a way that the only people who get the benefits of the ownership of a stationary class. If I could advise your politicians, don't ever give anybody a tax benefit unless it broadens ownership.
Right.
Because the same thing that is desirable with the station with a concentrated ownership is more desirable with a broadened ownership.
When you say, I'm sorry, Professor Robert, when you say broad ownership, are you talking about shares? Would that be an example?
Talking about what?
When you say broad ownership, are you talking about shares within
Shares?
company?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, shares. That makes me want to say something. You know, the land trust that enables people to buy the houses, right? Why doesn't it? The same cash flow will enable them to buy the land, and the land's even more valuable. That will enrich them even more. The Louis Kelso, and I think he was right, was not fond of the co-op approach. Co-op concentrates, socializes, if it will, the ownership of capital. Much better to spread it. Now, I'm not saying it's true in every instance. There are some reasons for socialized capital. You certainly don't want a capitalistic fire department. When people rail against socialism, I say, what do you got against the fire department? You don't want that controlled by market decisions because you can't control the damage done by fire. You don't want people to protect themselves according to what they can afford. But there's room for but almost anything. If somebody comes and says, we want to invest, we want to employ your employees, we're willing to give you some taxes to support their welfare people, but we want to own all the ownership. Why? Because they have financiers that can advise them. Well, the same financiers that can advise them, you can pay for it. For you. There's no monopoly on capitalism. There are plenty of capitalists that would love to capitalize poor people if they only were taught, and they're not, the advantage of more broadly ownership. Every investment can be, most investments can be enhanced by broadening ownership, and that's what negotiations are about. So I don't know much about your. I'm very ignorant about your group, but is there any nation in the world where you have a decisive majority, or a sizable minority that says you've got political power? In which case, educating the people of that tribe, if they have allegiances in the tribe, is worthwhile.
Right, right. I was more interested, Professor Robert, in and I could see this inclusive capitalism exemplary in the credit union, right, where there's a gathering of capital, and in the credit union uses this mass amount of capital to invest from its large pool of members. But what is the issue with the cooperatives?
Well, I have to know the particular case. There are circumstances under which a co-op may make sense, but it's not generic. It's not across the board.
Okay.
It depends upon how the economics of the particular. Not every transaction necessarily is cooperative, but the advantage of the advantage of a corporation and its flexibility to create individual ownership, and enables corporations to acquire capital with its future earnings.
Right.
Now, I teach corporate law. They don't teach that that's the advantage of corporations. They teach the advantage of corporations is limited liability, centralized management, and control. But they don't teach you that the centralized management and the ability of the corporate and the stability of the corporation is what enables them to acquire capital with future earnings.
I like that. I like that.
Every major company in the world that's become a billionaire company is a corporation. It's because it has advantages. Doesn't have to be owned by a billionaire. It can be owned by many people. The genius of a corporation is that it creates individual ownership, which appreciates over time as the entity becomes more profitable. Not because of labor, but because of the business it can do. And that's its own advantage. It's a distinct advantage.
Future earnings.
Yes, future earnings of capital.
Future earnings.
Roughly 25% of America's companies.
And you said decentralized, right? Decentralized.
It is centralized.
Centralized.
It is centralized. Look at a corporation can make a contract to promise to repay somebody 10 years from now. And it can keep that promise even though the shareholders change or disagree. Corporations can enter into contracts, and long-term contracts are credit transactions. And so they're advantageous. Now, not for every corporation, for every time. This all has to be decided on individual enterprises. But my suspicion is that if you're going to find ways to increase the interest in tourism in your country, first of all, you're going to need an outside person, outside people who can assess that and can help you with that. I don't know. Also, I'm not in the business of doing that. But whatever they plan to do, I believe you can structure it in a way that it'll be more profitable if the poor and the middle class of your country are included in the future capital earnings. I think so. I won't be categorically. It is. You look at it as Ralph said. It's an additional option.
Yeah, that's
It has
almost
to be appreciated.
non-existent.
It has a lot of political appeal. But I don't know. I'm ignorant. Ralph, I think, is ignorant on the particular things. If you believe that you can make money on tourism, you'll make more money on tourism if the population isn't burdened by debt and crime and taxes. You're going to make more money that way.
Right.
If you would benefit from I choose Walmart because Walmart basically needs people who want food, clothing, shelter. You know, I mean, clothing,
Technology.
those kind of things. You know, now if you want to enhance your earning capacity, people, unless they want to weave their own clothes, they're going to want to buy clothes from places. If there aren't many Walmarts in your country, it's probably because people can't afford the Walmart product. But that can change. And then you can create an entity which will enable them to buy Walmart products and only Walmart products. Now, if you capitalize some of your tribal members and they become shareholders and they get dividends that only can be used on Walmart products, it's okay. We'll exchange them for somebody who wants to buy Walmart products. And that doesn't even have to be in your country. And the exchange they'll pay you money for those chips. See what I mean?
Yeah, local products. The tourists would want to buy local products.
Yeah. I mean,
local food.
if Americans could buy Walmart products by buying credits from your tribal owners at a 10% discount, why wouldn't they do it? Now your people would take a 10% discount on the value of the dividends. It's better than nothing.
Yeah, we have to study this.
Your ability to create consumer demand isn't localized to your country. You can create consumer demand anywhere. All you need is an exchange mechanism. See what I mean? Now,
So what products or services
it has
you
to be
provide?
worth the setup costs. I mean, it may not be good for everybody. But I think also, we haven't talked about it, but I think there are eleemosynary charitable institutions that if we could get to them, I mean, if you have a charitable lender that would be interested in helping your country, I'll explain how to help it more. So will Ralph. Ralph, is that making sense to you?
Yeah, I think some of the ideas that you were talking about in terms of exchanging ownership between, I mean, there's a complexity there that takes a while to kind of really explain how the mechanisms would work. I mean, I think in a nutshell, it's always just trying to focus on investments that are likely to be successful locally, and if finance is involved, right? The question is, how is that going to happen? Is it the individual who's running the entity that's taking out the loan, and it's a small endeavor? Is it more that if there's stock involved, if there's the scale of this organization is such that they can sell shares, would they be willing to sell them to a trust, right? That is then going to finance the growth that they want to see. So they have to, we have to create that kind of mechanism first. What is this trust? This trust is an entity that vets investments, that I would argue needs to look for sustainable, inherently sustainable ideas. And so you get the badge of honor, right? If you get money from the trust is vetted that what you're doing is going to enhance society's well-being, is going to promote environmental protection, right? There's got to be more to this trust, I think, to really make people look at it and pay attention to what is this trust doing. And then this trust is operating on behalf of people, right? The people who are connected with it, right? And it might be that it begins, you only have one investment, and by the time you've distributed that to everyone gets, 10 cents. But the next investment, it goes to 20 cents. The next and so over time, you will essentially have this capital income stream of dividend payments going to people as a capital income. And it's in addition to their labor income, right? And so, you know, I think there's lots of interesting ways to think about this, but it's really just you got to ground it. Like, what is the practical opportunity, economic opportunity? I'm hearing kind of tourism, I'm hearing like ports. You know, if you're reestablishing this deep water port and there's an appetite to think about these ideas, you've got to finance the redevelopment of this port in a way that's connected to the revenue streams of the port, right? So that as the port starts having ships coming in and out, there's going to be tariffs on the ships, docking fees, that kind of thing. That pays off the loan that you might have taken out to reestablish the port to make it a viable entity again. Now, once that loan is paid off, if you set this up in a way where there's a trust involved, that trust can distribute the money, you know, once the bank has been paid off, to the communities around the port, right? Or so that this is kind of how this logic works. I mean, the other thing about sort of tourism development is, you know, these hotels, right? These facilities, you can think of them as these anchor institutions. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be anchored in this community probably for a long time, as long as they're financially viable. Now, they will buy lots of things. They will buy electricity. They will buy food. They will buy products, right? So there's a part of the community wealth building model is to look at where those goods and services are coming from that is serving these kind of more anchor institutions. So there's an element here that could be quite interesting in your case, where you could start thinking about the supply of food, the supply of energy to these developments, and convincing them that, you know, if they have a locally sourced set of distribution, you know, food and energy, water coming into them, it's more sustainable for them. And if it's an international hotel chain, they will be beholden to the international eyes that come on them in terms of their sustainability performance. So it's in there, it's trying to find the alignment, right, between, you know, what's happening in these developments. Is there a way to say, how can you leverage that to enable economic development in the communities around them? And when those, you know, we talked a little about co-ops. So if there's a food co-op that provides food to these complexes, you know, if people have a profit share in that co-op, now you've got a sort of an employee, like an ESOP model kind of thing, or, you know, as long as there's some profit sharing, you now have ownership sort of elements in the entity itself. So they have work, and then they have an upside from the profits of the organization. And that's the key. It's not just 100% reliant on labor income only. So each time you develop an opportunity, there's sort of questions saying, well, what about the ownership structure of this entity? How does that work?
Could we broaden it and make it
It's
more
going to be
profitable?
broadened. That's the key thing. How do you broaden the wealth, the flow of money? It's sort of making visible the invisible. You know, that's what I always start thinking about. Is like, how do you, if you could visualize the flow of money around any development or any new idea, you would see immediately, is it going to end up concentrating wealth or broadening wealth, you know, distributing wealth, right? And so that's kind of the way I would think about this. Is, you know, I'm sure there could be, if you picked a specific example or picked a specific sector of the economy, you know, we could probably look at that and say, okay, well, what's practical, what's viable, and then see what opportunities might exist. I think that's probably, you know, if there was a next step, that's what I would recommend. You know, it's hard to talk generically, right? It's easier to talk specifically, right?
Yeah. But you've given us a lot of food for thought, because even though I picked energy as an example, I'm also looking at the source of water, for example, right? Are the rivers well maintained? Is there enough watershed on the river? Is it so that it could be self-sustaining in supplying us with water? And the more people are involved with, you know, planting trees along the river, keeping it clean and maintained, then that's self-sustainable and more people are buy into the concept of having a good source of water. And then not just water, but then the sewage system itself and the whole system recycle itself to maintain the demands from as the community grows. So yes, I see the more people are less alienated, the more they have something invested in the particular part of the economy.
Professor Ralph and Professor Robert, just before we close off, I'd like to ask you both to give us the Reader's Digest of inclusive capitalism as we're closing up, and why or how it is beneficial in comparison to other forms of capitalism that you are aware of.
Robert, do you want to go first?
You're welcome to go first unless you want me to go.
Just a Reader's Digest. Just
You know how
keep it
difficult that
quiet.
is for Professor Cyril. We don't answer questions like that with 2 sentences.
Well, all I'm going to say really is that, if you really pay attention to how technology and how capital is deployed in your everyday experience, right? At some point, you will start realizing that things you used to do are being done by capital. And you might be doing more things with capital that's actually replaced the work of other people around you. They've sort of embodied their skills and knowledge into that capital. They're no longer working anymore, and you're doing that task. I'm signing forms digitally now that used to be paper-based and have staff associated with that, right? So when you start seeing the role of capital doing work and sort of displacing work, it makes you start thinking about, well, what do we do if the mechanism of distributing wealth through wages begins to break down, right? And so we might have, what's happening in work is you have growth in high-skilled, high-paid jobs, growth in low-skilled, low-paid jobs, and then a hollowing out in the middle, at least in the US and many other industrialized countries, of the middle-paying, middle-skilled jobs. So we may be creating lots of work, but it's lower income. I think the majority of jobs being created are lower income, lower skilled. So this is the reality. The situation we're in is we have a future, I would sort of predict, that we're going to have sort of a minority of very well-paid jobs, a majority of low-income, lower-skilled jobs, and the hollowing out will just keep existing of the middle-class jobs. So binary economics gives you a way to think about, if the work is being done by technology, by capital, then maybe we should start thinking about a way of distributing the ownership of that capital, because the job mechanism of distributing wealth is not functioning as well as it used to. So, and I predict that it may have problems moving forward, given how powerful. And I think the generative AI sort of entity, we haven't even scratched the surface of what disruption potentially could come from AI.
Yeah, I actually have a question regarding AI as well, but maybe I'm assuming that Professor Robert is going to answer this question as well.
Well, I may just give, I would say here's a couple of 2 or 3 platitudes of principles, but they do involve talking to outside financiers, outside lenders. The capital that buys itself for the rich can buy itself more profitably as more people are included in the process, if that profitability enhances the participation of the outside financiers. So if you again, I don't know what your situation is. If you have a deal that would bring outside financing to one of the countries that you have a population base significant enough to influence that decision, there are other people who might want to compete for that acquisition that will do it in a more ownership broadening way. There's no expertise that an outside financer has that could not be bought by somebody else. Labor is for sale. So whatever it is you're thinking about doing, if you only have one entity outside that's willing to do it, then maybe that's all you got. But I try to get another one and get them to compete. And the one that gives you the best ownership broadening alternative, and it has to be an entity, has to be somebody who would benefit from the increased consumer demand that the broader ownership will generate. I don't know if it gives you that's the sort of that's the basic principle.
Right.
And again, I don't. Is there a country that you are in, your tribe is in, that has any political influence?
Yeah, Honduras,
Honduras. Okay.
Nicaragua, Belize. We do have in Belize. Belize
2 or
is
3.
relatively stable.
Can you give?
Democratic country, Belize. But I see clearly, Robert, this theory is very, to me, I'm not an economist, but I see clearly how capital increases production, right? Increases production, capital.
Well,
If I
if you have
capture-
Now,
like in farming, for example, if capital gets technology, and instead of having 10 guys plowing 1 acre, you just have 1 tractor doing that work in a couple hours. So capital does help, and then technology also. No, that aspect of technology, that aphorism you had on technology improves labor, is something that I have to grapple.
Robert, my understanding I'm always shift on economics.
That's an advantage.
my knowledge is very, very basic. But I know that as an economist, you depend a lot on statistics, on data. What is your projection regarding your professional discipline when it comes to AI? I mean, by the stroke of 1 key, you can get so much data and statistics about almost any topic or subject or country, and AI could spit out results like that. What's the next years?
Well, I don't have any answer for that. So you don't need me, Ralph.
I know it's what I'm seeing right now with sort of this generative AI and things like ChatGPT. You can prompt it to give you pretty much anything you want in written form, and now there's videos, now there's art. It will create art for you, right? The one thing that is really, really important is, we as an academic, I'm looking at the product from AI in a quite different way, I think, in my discipline area to what a student who doesn't have the 20 years of reading thousands of papers and hundreds of books, right? So, that I'm reading it with that's not true, this is true, that's interesting, that's completely wrong. Where did this come from, right?
So
Whereas a student's reading it with
the advantage for you is prompting them.
Right. Well, the concern I see is, what I think students need to really think about is the ability to vet what's coming out of it, and to somehow not just never take at face value what you're looking at, right? But it does give you, I mean, if you're looking at drafting, I tried it the other day for a conference sake, right? Outline a conference on this topic with this type of structure, and it does it 80% of the job is done for you. Now that would have taken probably hours to write that out. Personally, myself, just sat there typing it, and it wouldn't have been as good the first pass, right? Now, what it doesn't have is the nuance and the photo, like the specific details. But that's what's happening. It's allowing you to. It's this productivity, right? It's doing more of the work. It's literally doing the work for you, right? And so what might have taken several people to draft and come up with, and it's sort of getting you to the 80% draft in about 2 seconds, right? It's there in front of you. And then what you're doing is coming in. So, it's going to enable a lot of things to be done efficiently and quickly. And the question I always start thinking about is, well, what is the real impact then on work? And what does it do to work?
Whose work? Labor work or
Right.
capital?
Yeah, the capital's work is doing the work, right? And the question is, what does this do? How does this shape labor? And then how, more importantly, what about income from labor? Right? Because if it's the value added element, where is the true value being added? Is it in the capital doing the capital part of the task, or is it in the labor part? If it's more on the capital side, then labor is going to get paid less. Now, if the skills of the laborer is where the value is being added, then the wages will hopefully reflect that. So I think what's going to happen is you'll probably see a sort of on average over time, if AI and the technologies around it do more of the value added work, the owners of that AI will get the rents, they'll get the income. Yeah. Right. And so that's, I mean, it's hard to say because we just don't know where this is going to go. But any other technology that's happened over the past century or so, you've seen this kind of evolution, displacement of work. As Robert said, work gets created over time. But what I'm sort of pointing at is, fine, work is true, it's true. Jobs are created over time, but what is the pay? Yeah. And how is that pay linked to the productiveness of workers versus the productiveness of capital? And that's where binary economics comes in and says, you got to pay attention to that. You got to look at that and start thinking about this, because if you think that this, AI, this generative technology is doing more of the work, it's likely that the revenue streams will be linked to that in some way. So anyway, that's about as smart as I can get at midnight.
Gentlemen, I got to thank you all. I greatly appreciate you joining. Professor Ralph, Professor Robert, man, the information was dense. It's a lot, and I was able to pick out quite a lot as well. Hopefully, we could have a follow-up where we look at some type of solution-based, resource ideas, suggestions, how we could apply each that we share. Egbert, the last words before we close off.
Yes, and I want to thank Professor Ralph Hall and Professor Ashford from Syracuse University. Syracuse, have some big buffs, and it's exemplary here as we are introduced to this new economic theory on inclusive capitalism that is very pertinent to our growing economy in Belize, and particularly our community there in Dangriga. We could apply some of these principles so that we could be on the lookout to generate wealth for our community and move them out of poverty. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Professors,
thank you.
the last words is yours, Professor Ralph, Professor Robert.
Well, hopefully this has been engaging for anyone that's managed to stay with us for this long. And, I think if there's any feedback, any questions you have, maybe there's a way to put those in the platforms, YouTube or Facebook, and we can take a look at those and see if we can find a way to respond to the questions at a future date. And we're happy to do that.
Sounds good.
Very
Professor
good.
Ralph? I'm sorry.
Well, someone
Professor
asked me
Ralph?
how long do you think it would take for this to catch on? Louis
well-
Kelso always believed in the big fish strategy.
Well,
If I could get Andrew Yang to understand it, it could happen quicker. If I could get Bloomberg to understand it, who's the biggest fish in your tribe? Let's get to him.
Right.
yeah,
right,
yeah, we
right.
gotta work
Start with
on
your
that.
tribe.
We-
Who's
we
the
gotta-
biggest fish in your tribe?
We gotta work on that. We might ruffle some feathers if we call names.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
God bless you all.
Gentlemen,
you.
thank you so much. God bless. Have a good
Okay.
night.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night. Sure.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Folks, this is Dangriga Unmuted. Yours truly, Cyril Rowe. I want to thank each and every one of you for sticking with us. Tune in again next week, Monday at 8 p.m. I hope you learned something. I surely learned a lot.